Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this night lecture. It is a great honor and pleasure to welcome to Cabot University tonight our distinguished speaker, Professor Kevin Bales, who will talk about recent breakthroughs in anti-slavery work, new technologies, new ideas, and new approaches. This is a very important and timely topic, as modern slavery, as all forms of modern crimes, is fluid and ever-changing, and finding ways to expand on the heels of our global society. Understanding ways to research, discover, and fight this heinous phenomenon with the innovative means at our disposal is extremely important, and I'm sure we are going to learn a lot tonight. And we could not ask for a better person to tell us about it. Dr. Kevin Bales is Professor of Contemporary Slavery and Research Director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Co-founder of the NGO Free the Slaves, his 1999 book, Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, has been published in 12 languages, and Desmond Tutu called it a well-researched, scholarly, and deeply disturbing expose of modern slavery. The film, based on Disposable People, which he co-wrote, won the Peabody Award and 2 Emmys. The Association of British Universities named his work one of the 100 world-changing discoveries. In 2007, Professor Bales published Ending Slavery, How We Free Today's Slaves. In 2009, with Ron Soodalter, he published The Slave Next Door, Modern Slavery in the United States. In 2016, his research institute was awarded the Queen Anniversary Prize, and on the same year, he published Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World. You can watch Professor Bales' speeches on TED Talk, which I'm sure many of you see, and we are all delighted to the opportunity of having him lecture to us live on this important topic. I thank Professor Silvia Scarpa for her help in making tonight's event possible. Thank you very much. And with no further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Kevin Bales.
That was very generous. Thank you so much. The only thing I hate it when there's a long history, but I'm going to throw in one little thing that made me very proud in the year 2000, which was the Italian edition of my book, Disposable People, which is called Imagery, won the Premio di Reggio. And I had no idea that it was such a wonderful prize and a wonderful honor until I came. My publisher actually said, there's a book club in Pisa that wants to give you a prize. And I said, book club? But in fact, it turned out to be a national. And I was just really pleased I took my suit, because I didn't know that the whole thing was going to be on television. Because they have famous actors who read excerpts at the Premio di Reggio. Absolutely. So it was one of a very happy memories of that. Thank you so much. I'm going to not give you the talk about slavery that you might expect, in the sense that often people go and they want to hear a talk about human trafficking, they go to hear a talk about modern slavery, and they expect sad stories about poor people who have been in terrible situations, which of course that's exactly what slavery is as well, trafficking is as well. But I want to tell you a story that's a little more optimistic, because in the last 5 years we've been able to reach a critical mass. We've been able to reach a point in the history of both this anti-slavery movement and in the history of the scholarship that's about contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking, that we're taking it, well, we could say, to a new level. Where, the descriptive period where we try to understand the basics are now over. We think we have a good understanding of the basic knowledge, and we're beginning to elaborate with new tools and new ideas. So, a few of those new ideas, which I hope will stimulate your curiosity and maybe even want you to participate, make you want to participate in the future. This is an old breakthrough now, in many ways. It's been a couple of years ago now. But one of the things that was a big problem when this field was developing in the early thousands was that no one could make a decision, no one would agree how many people were in slavery. So it's a bit like, the coronavirus. We think we know how many cases there are, but we don't really know, and so we don't know exactly where they are, and that also means you don't know how to deal with it. It was the same with contemporary slavery. Finally, after years of negotiation, it was really diplomatic negotiation, we were able to bring together the United Nations, the ILO, the Law Free Foundation, several Institute of International Organization of Migration, and we were able to build the first agreed, reliable measurements of how much slavery there was in the world. Still an estimate, not absolutely fixed, but we feel pretty confident to be able to say something like 40.3 million people in the world. And this heat map is actually not a map of the raw numbers, but of the percentage of each country's population that is caught up in slavery or trafficking. So the darker reds are the places that have the highest percentage of the population. One of the reasons it's tricky to measure is because most countries, and developed countries as well, have a tiny fraction of their population. Italy would have a very tiny fraction, maybe 0.004 of less than 1/100th of 1% of its population would actually be caught up in this situation. But in Mauritania, it could be as high as 3 or 4%. In North Korea, it may be the highest yet, but that's because the state of North Korea is actually enslaving its citizens. So we're able, for the first time, to say how much and where, at least as an estimate. We're also very interested in the economics of slavery, because there's something new about contemporary slavery compared to all the slavery of the past. And of course, the slavery of the past goes back to the beginning of human history. We understand it from Babylonia, from ancient Sumeria, and so forth. But the one thing that has changed is that the cost of acquiring a person, in other words, the price of bringing someone into slavery, for the first time in history, has collapsed. Now, what does that look like? Oh, that's actually a piece of film. I'm not sure. We had this trouble when I practiced, okay? So I may have to just, and it won't even let me skip. So I'll have to skip that piece of film and come back. The film is simply of these two lads in Nepal, and they were an example. And you can see them carrying these heavy stones on their back. I will tell you, these two lads are free. They work with an NGO that I worked with, and they've come to freedom. But they were showing us what they had to do in slavery. They had been lured into slavery. Their parents had been told, we have a job for these children. They came from a rural village where there was no school. And of course, once the recruiter got them away from their parents, they just disappeared. No one saw them again, and they were put to work like donkeys. Their job was to carry heavy stones up and down the mountains into the cities in Nepal. Now, they're a perfect example of this collapse in the cost of human beings. Because the amount of money given to the parents, which was an advance on their future wages, but it wasn't true, was something like $5, $10, 5 euros, 10 euros. When these lads would be carrying these heavy stones, which they weighed more than they did, down to the cities, if they fell into a ravine, if they broke a leg, the slave owner would go down into the ravine and he'd take the stones away to leave the child. The children were disposable because it cost more to give them medical care than it did to just go and get another child with $5 or $10. The key difference of slavery today to the slavery of the past is that slavery in the past, slaves were expensive investments And today they are disposable inputs into economic processes. Here's a little chart of slavery, the cost of slaves over the last 4,000 years. I know it seems crazy that I could do this, but I worked with some economic historians. And the average price of people in slavery for most of human history, the average would be in today's money, call it 40,000 euros, something like that in today's money. But as you can see, as a complete mirror of the population explosion, the glut, the surplus, the oversupply of enslavable people in the global population has done exactly what supply and demand does. If you dramatically increase the supply of anything, the price falls. And that's what's happened. So that the average price now of a person that you want to bring into slavery around the world is around 90 euros. And it can go as low as 5 or 10. It can, in rich countries, it can be a low thousands, 2,000 or 3,000 at the most. But we've had this very dramatic shift, which has meant that we have to think differently about how we institute policies to deal with this problem. It doesn't work in quite the same way it did in the past. And you can see the dramatic relationship with the fact that, you know, the year I was born, there were about 2.5 billion people on the planet, and now we're just about to hit 8 billion people. It's a dramatic shift that no one has ever seen before on the history of our planet. In that context, there are other ways that we are beginning to get at what it means to be a slave. One is called Corpus Linguistics, which is actually the use of machine learning and a kind of deep statistical analysis of concepts, of grammar, of sentence structure, of vocabulary. So we have pulled together in our lab about 1,500 narratives of people who have been enslaved. First voice accounts of what their lives were like in slavery. We put them all together and then begun to actually pull out from not their individual records, but from all the millions of words that they have there. Now, I've made a little word cloud, right? Everybody's seen a word cloud, except for Sylvia, because she doesn't follow technology. But everyone's seen a little word cloud that you can see on the internet any day. And you can go you can Google word cloud, you can make your own word cloud. And I made this word cloud out of about 30,000 words from the voices of 3 people who have been enslaved. So it was just a small amount of slave narrative. And even just running a little word cloud, I would have thought, oh, isn't it interesting that thought was the most powerful idea that they were coming to. And oh, and move, and bells, and laughter, and God, and you know, all of this had something. But this is a very simplistic thing. This is really just how often did they say certain words. With Corpus Linguistics, it's like a supercharged word cloud with many dimensions. And here are some of the things that we've been finding. When we look into hundreds of minds, which is in a sense what you're doing, we're finding that survivors of slavery rarely use the future tense. That there's something about the lived experience of being in slavery that makes it difficult to even think in the future tense or talk about it. And if they do touch on the future, they go immediately to a sudden past tense. We're still trying to understand what all this means. We also found that backs up some of the work done by our survivor scholars and researchers, because we now have survivors of slavery who are becoming high-ranking researchers and scholars of this, who have said, to understand what it's like to be in slavery, to actually have the lived experience of slavery, you have to understand the idea of atemporality. In other words, that you are without time. And what that means is that if you're a person who's caught in that state of being that we call slavery, you don't think about the future, and you don't think about the past. And you don't do that because if you do, you will suffer pain for it. That slaveholders want slaves to live in an eternal present. They want them to only think about their needs as a slaveholder. They want them to only think about the moment that they're only in. They don't want them to think about their past in freedom, or a future in freedom, or a future in any sense. So they literally harm people in slavery if they're thinking ahead or behind. So they learn to think, I only live in this moment, ever. I close my mind to every other bit of time. And they also do it in terms of space. They learn not to think of movement, to only go where they're told and only to occupy the space they're given. Atemporality and aspatiality. Now this is powerful when we begin to understand these things that the survivors are helping us to learn. I had worked 15, 20 years with people in slavery, and I'd never seen it. I'd seen it, but I never understood it. I couldn't see it. But as soon as the survivors begin to explain and to do their own analysis, wow, it woke us up. And we now understand better again. How do we begin to operate those rehabilitative, careful support systems that help them to recover from the trauma of slavery? Now I was inside people's heads. Now I'm going to jump into space. We've been doing a lot of work from space. Here's an example. So this is something that I just took from Google Earth. This is in the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site at the bottom of Bangladesh. It's an absolutely protected area. It's a special breeding ground for rare animals. It's not supposed to be touched. It's supposed to be left absolutely alone. But as you can see, if you're looking at this from space, you can see that on the right, it's a mangrove forest, but something else is happening on the left. Now I know those look a bit like buildings, but they're actually not buildings. They're fish drying rats. In fact, children are, like those boys in Nepal, are lured down from coastal villages with the promise of some work, and then they disappear, and they're taken to these places hidden in the UNESCO World Heritage forests, and they are put to work, and it's horrific. They work sometimes 24 hours straight, they're beaten, they're sexually assaulted, they have terrible problems with their health because they're living in wet, sticky, fish, awful kind of stuff. There's a very brave colleague of mine who was able to get a picture. He was undercover and was able to take a picture of a modern slave master beating children to make them work faster on the racks. It was straight out of the 19th century, but it's not. It's the 21st century. One of the things we were able to do as we began to have greater access to the satellite imagery and the satellites themselves, is I went, in the very first project that we did with this, I said, I had taken this to the satellite experts and I said, I think we could see slavery from space. And they said, we don't do that. You know, our job is to look at forests, or maybe to look for oil, or, you know. But I convinced them, and we began to work together on it. Now they like it a lot, because they say it's a lot more interesting than looking for oil. Everybody wants to look for oil. They say this is much more fun, but also fun. So we did a little pilot project, a very small project, just on those fish camps, on that fish camp. But what we were able to discover within 3 weeks was that there were 5 more of these slave camps that no one knew about. They were hidden away in the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And because satellite imagery goes back in time for at least 20 years, we were able to identify earlier camps and where they moved and why they moved, usually because of sea level rise, and how things changed over time. And then that led us to stage 2, as we begin to work that. Now I will tell you, I'll jump back and say, we took all this to the government of Bangladesh. We said, you have a serious problem here, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and so forth. But sadly, the Bangladeshi government has some components are very corrupt, And one of the greatest mafias, you could say, in Bangladesh is the shrimp mafia, the shrimp and fish mafia. One of the biggest exports from Bangladesh is shrimp, prawns. They go all over North America, all over Western Europe, and they're making billions from this. They do not want to rock this boat. So they said, we understand what you're telling us, but we can only intervene if we have a complaint from one of the mothers of one of the children. And we're like, how can we even tell you who the mother is if we can't? So they were blocking it. We then also begin to talk about brick kilns. Now, I'd worked in the past on slavery and brick kilns in Pakistan, and after we realized that we could use satellites for lots of things, we said, let's look at brick kilns in South Asia. There's this area called the Brick Belt of Pakistan, India, and Nepal, where there are thousands of brick kilns. Very primitive kilns, large, but very primitive, like in the Bible. You know, when the Jews are in Egypt, they're like literally making bricks with straw and clay in their hands, and they're firing them with, that's what they do. They're large, but they're doing it in a 2,000-year-old, 3,000-year-old technology. We said, though, no one knows how many kilns there are in the world, or in this region. Nobody knows how many people are on them. Nobody knows where they all are, except for the people who live next to them. So the first thing we tried was something that you could have taken part in, because it was crowdsourcing. We used a website that's used for scientific crowdsourcing. So you are trained, this is a screen from it, you're trained on your own home laptop to identify brick kilns. You're shown how to mark them on the map. The computer generates for you samples from all the satellite imagery over this enormous space. This is northern India, southern Pakistan, southern Nepal. It's an enormous space. And then you're the person who is helping the computer and putting the identification. Now, students, especially all over the world, took part in this, and it was very exciting for them, and they thought, this is great, we're identifying. What they didn't actually even know at the time, though, was that as we began to do this identification, is that in fact, we had written the algorithms behind the crowdsource, so that there was machine learning going on. Now, of course, journalists always talk about artificial intelligence, which is not exactly what this is. This is really just machine learning. But we were letting the machine learn. And very quickly, the machine did learn. It took about 5 weeks of students putting in and identifying, and then suddenly it clicked and said, I think I got this now, or whatever this computer say when they've learned, right? And within, I think, 6 hours, it gave us the precise location of every brick kiln in Pakistan, India, and Nepal, and over into China and down into Bangladesh. Now, and in places where we didn't expect them to be. And once again, because satellites images go back in time, we were then able to let it, because it had already learned how to see them, it could move back in time through images, and it showed us how the brick industry had moved from place to place, how it fed different building booms in different cities, and so forth. And now we use this to begin to open up where are the areas where we need to go and look to do the work to helping people come out of slavery in the brick kilns. Not every brick kiln has slavery, but we feel that at least half do, because it's very common. We can also take that kind of information and we can layer it up. So this is just the first example is a fairly simple one. It's some of the work based around some of the work that I had been doing in the Amazon. So satellites plus on-the-ground data plus time series over time plus counting people who had been enslaved and even people who had been murdered in the process of enslavement. So here's a satellite. We're back much further. This area that you're looking at is not Brazil. It's actually the Amazon basin. So this is the drainage of the Amazon. And you can see the purpley Amazon River up at the top, that funny color. Now the key to the colors here is that The green parts of this picture are the parts of the Amazon which are protected and have not been cut. So these are the green parts that here are parts of the Amazon, which is that great Amazon forest that we're all hoping will survive, which haven't been cut. Now I have to say it would look worse than this now because under Bolsonaro we have some real problems with the Amazon. The yellow bits are actually the parts of the Amazon which should never have been cut, which have been cut. So that's the illegal deforestation is all the yellow. The magenta, what color is that? Pink? I don't know. At the bottom, that was commercial land, that was agricultural land, so we're not so interested in that. But what you can see here is when you take the blue dots, which were slavery cases, and the red dots, which are found murders, and you can watch how areas have been invaded by criminals who use both slavery and environmental destruction. And just inside that, for example, just inside the last ring, you see a bit that's suddenly yellow with a ring of murders around a big blue dot, which is something like 40 known slavery cases, where a criminal gang has gone in, they've begun to clear cut everything. So not careful management of forestry, but literally just devastation. And I have to say, we know that these murders in particular are very much an undercount, because one of the ways with disposable workers, if you're in the Amazon, what happens is you simply work them almost to death, and then you shoot them, and then you bury them in the forest. And I left that bit out, but I also have film of going out to find the bodies in the forest and so forth, because it's easier to just hide the evidence if you're working out in the Amazon, because you're so far away. That's a lot of what we do with the satellites. Then we take the satellite information, and now I'm moving again to another part of the world where we're taking machine learning and layering the information into the machine learning. So I'm not sure if we can see, yeah, we can see this. So some of it has to do with, if you go on to the left, we have these ground truthing, where we actually put people on the ground and we ask people questions, and we take personal observations and so forth. And then we also use proxy imagery that we can take from the few statistical sources that we get, and we can layer that onto the satellite images as well. But we use these machine learning models to help us take it through, to work through the algorithms that blend all of these things together in the power that they each individually bring. And you end up with taking things like cell phone data. That's really interesting. If you want to get all the information about all the calls and money transfers that happen on all the phones, if you wanted to do that in Italy, they would never let you. But we have found that in a number of the African countries, if we talk to them and explain that we don't want to know the details, we don't want to know the individuals, we just want to know the patterns, they will give us the data. And in Tanzania in particular, we've had the data for a couple of years now. So we can trace, we can actually digitize and then replicate on top of a map all the money that's flowing between cell phones, because they're using, in Africa you use your phone for your bank much more than you do here. And money is transferred constantly. And you can actually say, oh, something in that little village is receiving an enormous amount of money. What could that be? Is that drugs? Is that this? Or is that that? Is it? You then begin to take the drone imagery and the satellite imagery. So these are just examples of both. Now we're in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. You work through these stages of layering the phone data, the text data, the SMS data, the moving the money, the space technology data, ground truth it, and then you build proxy data, which are these indicators, until you're able to use the combined machine learning to generate models of risk. And you can begin to say, this is the sub-area of this city where we have to look carefully. This is an area where education is needed. This is where awareness needs to be raised. This is a forced labor ground truth. Then when we were generating it, all the patterns, and then we went into those places and said, in Swahili, you know, and kind of randomly in these little units, I know there are people, some people in this sub-ward, very small area, who are forced to work against their will. And then that also gives us another way to check and to understand the density of this. The measurement of this kind of crime is difficult but possible in rich countries, but almost impossible in some of the poorest countries. And that's because, in part, because that's Dar es Salaam. There are no maps of Dar es Salaam that have any density or housing in it. It's only roads. I mean, you don't know if you're talking about 1,000 people per square kilometer, 5,000 people per square kilometer, 3 people per square kilometer. You don't have it unless you build it yourself. Okay. I know that was a little mind-boggling. It is for me too. I don't work that team. I have this team of people, and then I have to have translators because they're speaking languages that I don't always follow. But then we begin to take those focused pieces of work and we go out to other global issues. So here's something we just published a week ago. This is just one chart from an article, which is about not slavery in the world, but about, in fact, deforestation. So this is a map not of just slavery or deforestation. It's about slave-based deforestation. So it's helping us to understand that part of climate change, that part of environmental destruction that you can't get at from the official figures because it's being done by criminals. And it's being done often by criminals in, again, back to Bangladesh, protected forests. Now we're able to do that and make those predictions. And these are areas which are especially hard hit. Brazil, Ghana, Mozambique, Indonesia, areas where we are now able to go back and say, okay, you can see, we can show you the areas where this is happening. We can show this the areas where you need to be looking and guarding. Because so many of what you're seeing here are those areas which are supposed to be protected, but they're not protected well enough to actually save nature. I mean, I hate to say it in that simplistic way, but it's the case. One of the unintended consequences of a very well-intended policy was in the early thousands, a lot of countries, and Brazil, Ghana, Mozambique, and Indonesia were all ones of those countries. They set aside forests. Under the pressure of the idea of climate change, under the idea that we needed to hold on to forests, they set forests aside. But the unintended consequence was this. They set the forests aside, and the legal timber companies backed away. They said, no, that's fair, we should help you. But the criminals stepped in. And the key problem was that while each of these countries and several others set aside forests, they didn't set aside, nor were they helped by rich countries to protect the forest. So you literally have 2 men with 1 bicycle for 1,000 square kilometers of forest, and they're supposed to guard this forest. Meanwhile, you have criminals who have 4-wheel drive vehicles, power saws, slave labor, and on, being able to go in and do it. And if the forest protectors try to protect it, they end up murdered for their work. The situation in eastern Congo, in the Virunga National Park, which is the oldest and most lavish park, nature park in all of Africa, is that the rangers are dying at about the rate of 2 or 3 a year now. It's amazing the bravery that they bring to that job. Why are we worried about slavery and forestry? Well, because when we work together, a few years ago, and it was one of the key points, really the factoid of my book, Blood and Earth, was I worked with the UN to determine how much of the deforestation in the world is happening illegally and with slave labor. And we worked and worked and worked to estimate this. Now it's an estimate, it can't be precise, but it's an estimate. And when we put that together in terms of how much CO2 is being emitted through deforestation, here's the crazy thing. If slavery were a country, we would have the population of Algeria or Bulgaria, and it would have the gross domestic product of Bulgaria, or for that matter, the state of Kansas, just a little state of Kansas in the United States. As the 40 million people is the population of Algeria. It's a little larger than California. The GDP is the estimated UN expenditure in the slavery economy, criminal economy, is about $150 billion per year. That's the turnover in Bulgaria. It's the turnover in the state of Kansas. So if slavery were a country, we would be talking about a small country. 40 million people is not it's not a tiny country, but it's not a big country. And it would be a poor country. But if you measure the carbon emission from slavery, deforestation plus brick kilns plus other types of highly polluting production that's done with slave labor, because remember, there are no regulations when you have slave labor. Criminals do whatever they like. But the carbon emission by this country would put slavery as the third largest carbon country in the world after China and the United States. The carbon emissions from slavery are almost double that of the entire continent of Africa. So we're talking about a horrific fact, which on the other hand almost becomes a hopeful fact. Now I know that sounds odd, but why would it be hopeful to learn that slave labor is in fact one of the major contributions to climate change? Well, it's hopeful because slavery is fundamentally illegal everywhere we go. We learned that some countries don't have specific laws, but basically there's international laws that say slavery, like genocide under international law, is always forbidden everywhere. That means that you don't have to argue with people about is there or is there not climate change to save a forest. You can simply say, there's slavery, it's illegal, we have to stop it. So suddenly, you're able to approach both problems from the side of each other. So you begin to take what is really a vicious cycle, slaves being used to destroy the environment, which pushes people into vulnerability because they can't make a living anymore, so they end up being refugees, which means they end up in slavery, which they are used to destroy going that way, to reversing it possibly and stopping the slavery and hopefully even employing freed slaves to do the reforestation, which is possible with the thing called carbon credits, so that the vicious cycle becomes a virtuous circle, going the other direction. It could actually dramatically alter the way we confront both the human rights issue and the enormous climate emergency that we're facing. Now, here's a few things that are kind of breakthroughs, but also I'm taking you out to the edge now. I'm taking you out to the edge. One of the things that we've thought about for a long time is if you're going to work on slavery, and there's 40 million people in slavery, there's probably a lot of people, probably in the low millions of people who own or control those slaves. And you have to think carefully about if we're going to bring this criminal activity to an end, we have to understand the criminals too. And we also have to think about what happens in a society when a whole village of people in hereditary slavery come out of slavery, but then the family that's been enslaving them for generations is still living right next to them. Right? That's sort of the American problem in the Deep South. Right? That's what happened there. So one of the things we've been studying is ISIS. Now, does anyone else read The Beak? The ISIS online magazine, just two of us here in the room. Let me just say to you as students, don't go look at it online. You will get a call from the security forces. Right? They do, well, maybe not in Italy, but in the UK, if you bring up Dabiq and you want to look at Dabiq, you get this, people come around and say, like, what are you doing? Because they're worried about radicalization. Right? But I want you to just note, this is the magazine of ISIS. I'm not even sure it's still publishing at the moment, but, because it had some setbacks. But notice this article about the revival of slavery before the hour. And this was an article in their magazine where they were explaining why God made it clear that ISIS could enslave people. Why this was a good thing. Why this was going to help bring on the end of the world. Why, which is one of the things they were hoping for. The apocalypse. They wanted to foster the apocalypse. And how this could bring great success and peace on the earth would be one of the reasons was to let them enslave people. In fact, here's a map that we just generated because we've been able to take delivery of a significant amount of captured ISIS documents. So headquarters in northern Iraq, we were able to get access to the captured documents from the different forces, including the U.S. forces. There were areas where they were taking people into slavery, primarily the Yazidi places, the Yazidi ethnic areas. And then there were all of these other places, but just look at the legends. The registration sites. They had a registration system for every person they took into slavery. They had slave markets, physical slave markets in towns and cities. They also had training centers where they took enslaved children to put them through indoctrination and military training. And then they had military bases where they would hold people. They also had online sites where they sold women to people around the Middle East in online auctions, which was all part of the tactical use of slaves, not just to generate child soldiers, not just to generate workers, not just to generate women enslaved into sexual exploitation, but also to generate raw funds. It turns out that we can tell from these records that have been captured that in 2014, they were making about $2 million a day from all sources that they had, which included selling oil and arms and other things. But slave trafficking was an important part of that income stream. We're still picking that apart. And it amazed me that there was actually someone who was called the Minister of Spoils, which if you're not a native English speaker, that may seem a strange spoil. I don't mean that the food has gone bad. It's just that things captured in war and conflict are called the spoils of war. In other words, things that you steal because you won something in war. I apologize for so many words, but one of the things that just to point out is that we realized as we analyzed that they weren't just using slavery as a tactic. In other words, they weren't just using it to raise funds, to provide labor, to provide sex. They were also using it as a strategy. It was part of a genocidal strategy. Because every woman they could take and impregnate, in some ways in their minds, wiped away her ethnicity and created in her a holy vessel for their offspring. And their plan was, in a sense, to remove their ethnicity by rape and marriage, which they accomplished by raping them, and then impregnate them so that they would be propagating not someone from a different ethnicity, but someone they would become an ISIS fighter, an ISIS group. They were using enslavement to wipe away a group of people that had been marked for extinction. And these are just sort of the different ways that happened. Right? Certainly the executions. There were mass executions of the men who were in that ethnicity and of all the older women. They would be separated, marched away, and then massacred and just butchered. And then slowly there would be cleansing. They were cleansing, ethnic cleansing, this whole area to make it part of a pure caliphate. Now, I think where I'm about to come to an end, but I wanted to just say, one of the things that we're working hard on is that if you knew anything about the world's movement about human trafficking and modern slavery from when it started about 20 years ago, you'll know that almost all the work at the beginning, in the early thousands, was very emotional, very simplistic. It was all about, there are these young women are being tortured, they're being sold for sex, this is a terrible crime. It was the people who wanted to do it, they wanted to save people, and it seemed like they often wanted to save people to make themselves feel better. It was a very disorganized and not very thoughtful approach to a global problem. And I have to say at the beginnings, it almost only focused on enslavement into sexual exploitation, almost none of the other types of enslavement. What we want to do is understand the complexity, approach it from a logical way, become unified in this way and organized in this way. So here's where we're going. Here's some of the next things that we're doing. We're setting up research now that will look at the brain images of matched sets of slavery survivors and people who have never been enslaved. We want to look at the brains and see if slavery changes the way a brain works and looks, because especially works. Now it's interesting that we don't have this already. We know all about the brains of American football players. We know a lot about the brains of European football players, because they do headers, and then they get brain damage. We know about the brains, we have this kind of imagery of Holocaust survivors, Romanian orphans, soldiers, lots of brain imaging on soldiers who have been in combat situations, so we know about these brain changes. But we know that that kind of trauma and that kind of violence is common among enslaved populations. So we want to look at their work. It's been very interesting to me that it's been 3 or 4 years now that we've gone to different funding agencies and say, we want to look at the brains of enslaved people. And they say, well, what are you going to find? And we say, we don't know because no one's ever looked. And they say, well, we don't know. It's been very interesting that people haven't wanted to do this right away. But we'll get there. Because one of the things that happens when you have damage in brains is that you have what's called epigenetic damage as well, which is how your genes express themselves, which then leads to different problems of health that are not related to the brain. So, it's a whole area that we are cracking. We're going to keep working until we crack into this. We're thinking carefully about the anthropocene. We can see ahead of us the way all of these problems are exacerbating each other. That's why they're about to change the name of the time that we live in to the Anthropocene. So we won't live in the Holocene anymore. We're going to be living in the Anthropocene because the world has altered to the point where the most powerful impact on the planet is human beings, the Anthropocene. And you can see here, pretty much the vast change in ozone and foreign investments and motor vehicles and species loss and water use and on and on. And of course, if you remember the line of the graph of slavery, it also just, the cost, the population goes straight up, but of course the cost and the number of slaves went up, but the cost of human beings went down. You need to understand the complexity of this interaction, because this is our future. You can see, especially you guys, you're younger than I am, right? You see where it's all going through the right side? That's you. That's your life. So, we have about 18 teams working in different zones. We have about 100 researchers that we do this. We're trying to make unified research. It's called the Rights Lab. And that was a little quiz of a journey with a fairly unreliable narrator, I think, of a tour guide around the world of anti-slavery. But I'm very happy to answer any questions you have to talk about this, or if you want to challenge, or you want to debate among all of the things. Let's go.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure that the students will have a lot of questions. It has been very technological, I have to say. So let's open the floor for the
Sure.
questions.
And do we want to run around with one of
Coming
these?
up,
Or-
yes.
Or it's a small, that we can try.
I can speak loud.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's not gonna work for the, because we are on.
And I can repeat.
So the map at the beginning that you showed the percentage of each country's population that had the mistake, I was like curious about how it was calculated because I was surprised by some of the more democratic and liberal countries had not like it was a light yellow shade, but it wasn't like the lightest yellow. Like I saw the United States was a yellow, but then the Scandinavian countries were a bit of a lighter yellow.
Yes.
Just kind of show the difference there. I was just curious about how that's calculated.
How that's calculated? The answer is a mixed bag, right? For a number of those countries, especially the rich countries, if you're thinking about the rich countries, have been until recently the hardest place to measure, because the total number of people enslaved in the population of Norway is very small, and which means they're almost impossible to identify. You can't do a survey. You can't expect to find it through the police records or like that. We've since, actually just about the time that was coming out, we had a bit of another breakthrough that I didn't tell you about, which was another way to calculate and measure it, called multiple systems estimation. We did it for the United Kingdom first. So in the United Kingdom, they knew, for example, that they had 2,453 cases in a year of trafficking and slavery. But when we were able to use this new technique, which would give you a reliable estimate of the total that should be out there. This is a technique that was first used to figure out how many fish were in fjords, or how many deer were in a forest, right? So it's a way to estimate numbers that you can't see. We said, it turns out that there was something like 11,000 people in slavery in the UK. Now, after we published that and we were able to start teaching other people around the world, Norway's about to do it themselves. Belgium's already done it. Belgium, Netherlands done it. Poland's done it. Several other countries. Spain's doing it. Argentina was just in touch with us last week saying we want to do it. So we're beginning to get better ways of measuring. Other places in the poorer countries, you can actually use a survey. You can use a random sample survey. And not ask, are you a slave? But say, has anything like this ever happened to anyone in your family? And then you have this a number of things. They were offered a job, but it turned out to be not what they thought. They had to be taken away, so you give them the scenarios. But you could actually get a good measure in India, places where we were able to use that. And then there are those areas where we don't know. Afghanistan, you can't go surveying, right? It's a little dangerous in places. North Korea won't let us in. We actually used satellite imagery that we generated for North Korea to look at the prison camps, and then even talked about what size of the population, working with North Korean refugees and so forth. So it's a whole mixed bag is the answer. And none of it's terribly precise, right? But all of it, we're creeping the reliability and the precision step by step as we go. That was a very nerdy question. That was even a much nerdier answer than you probably wanted. What's another question? Right behind you. Run it back.
So one of the countries that you pointed out was Brazil, and I was wondering what would you propose, because I know that a lot of the deforestation related to slavery has to do with corruption in companies, how they corrupt officials and so forth.
Sure.
So would you fix corruption first or forced labor first?
Are you Brazilian?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's a tricky one. And let me say something nice about Brazil, okay? Because for all the problems that are in Brazil with the corruption, and it's even worse now than it was before, Brazil has some of the very best anti-slavery laws in the world, if not the best. Sadly, a lot of those laws have been kind of put into the refrigerator by Bolsonaro, but they have amazing laws. They have mobile anti-slavery squads that can fly anywhere when there used to be able to fly anywhere when there's a slavery. They They have mobile judges who actually are in jeeps, and they go straight to where the slavery is happening in the forest, and they go, you're going to jail, you're free, right? Pay this, you know. So the judgments are happening in a mobile way. They have support for people who have come out of slavery. It's remarkable, right? Now, but they also face enormous problems with corruption, and especially the corruption in the wild areas. You know, we've all seen those movies of the Wild West with the crazy cowboys. Well, I got to tell you, because I've been out there on the wild edges of the Amazon, and it's wild. The nearest law enforcement is 100 miles away, 200 kilometers away. There are murders, but no one comes. I mean, it's not what we're used to. And then, when you have governments that kind of get the green light and say it's okay to act this way, so it's got to be corruption and forced labor and on, right? One of the things that I also have to say about Brazil, which is powerful but sad, is that it is either number 1 or number 2 in the global rankings in the number of anti-slavery workers who are murdered every year. And a lot of them are religious sisters, nuns, who do this work in the countryside, who are then murdered by people who are criminals who are involved in slavery. And it's pretty shocking like that. And until that's kind of, I'm hoping for a turn at the corner, but we'll see what happens in Brazil. Meanwhile, they've got amazing people who do amazing work on it and who are very brave. What's another question?
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. My question is a very general one. Doing all this work, and I think that obviously from an academic point of view this is very interesting, but I think in a more general sense, what is your personal take? I mean, are we moving, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the future of slavery? Because in a way, it seems that it's becoming easier and easier to slave people. So I wonder, what is your take about where we're going with this?
Sure. Well, I feel optimistic. But I also feel optimistic because I was born with like a gland that makes me optimistic almost all the time. I'm kind of a happy, optimistic person. So, but I think there are actually reasons to feel optimistic. One of the things is that we now have an idea about the size. We also have an idea about the cost. Like, what would it cost to dramatically reduce the number of people in slavery? It would be about $20 billion, and it would take about 20 years to do it. To go from, say, 40 million to 1 million, something like that. And that's amortized across all these different places, because in some places it's actually really inexpensive to bring people out of slavery. Other places it's more expensive. We know we have to have laws, we understand the processes now. That's work that's not very interesting to talk about, but the kind of place-by-place unique sets of conditions that you can use, that we've used monitoring and evaluation, learning to plot where would this go if we like a good business, if we were to extend this into the future, what would be our projections? Now, 20 billion. That's a lot of money. It's also the cost of like 2 submarines maybe. If you're in the military, I don't know, there's an admiral, I don't know how much submarines cost, but they're around this, right? Over a 20-year period, again, we're not talking about much. We've watched the amount of expenditure in the last 20 years go from a few million up to maybe we're at 300 million, 400 million now globally into anti-slavery work. We've watched the number of people coming to freedom go from a few hundred into now in the tens of thousands per year. But we're still nowhere near, right? We're just at the launch point. Now my fear, my pessimistic side, is that I look at the anthropocene, right? And I say, at what point do those increasing problems of CO2, weather, you name it, reach a point where slavery becomes a non-issue? Because the main issue will be, can I eat, can I survive, right, and so forth. So, on one level I'm optimistic because I look at something like how the World Health Organization brought an end to smallpox over a 30-year period, spending about that much money. Careful research, careful planning. Smallpox is easier than slavery, maybe, but it's almost the same with HIV/AIDS. Now suddenly HIV/AIDS is going way down. Very few reinfections. It took that kind of long thinking and investment. The money's going up. We're actually having more economic resources to devote to anti-slavery than we have human resources to deliver it. Which is why one of the things that we do at Nottingham is have a master's degree that teach people how to be professional anti-slavery workers. So that so we need the human resources as well as the financial resources. So I would say, maybe, right? To be totally honest, can we do it? Maybe, depending on what else happens. I know that there are 3 anti-slavery movements before this one. They all succeeded in ways that were mostly good. The second one involved the American Civil War, which is a bit of a, not the way you want to bring any social problem to an end by killing 2 million people. You don't, that's not probably a good idea. But could we do it? Yeah. And if we had the kind of buy-in where, remember this is a bill, $20 billion. If you spread that across, I think just the population of North America, it works out to like $13 or $5. I mean, it's not much. It's not much. And if the commitment was there, we would be well on the way. Now, I also know criminals are criminals, and they're clever, and they're always trying to stay ahead. So that last million of people in slavery, I think, would be the really hardest. But can I see the future? No. If only I could. What's another question? Back there.
You just said you can't see the future, so maybe this is a silly question, but I'm wondering whether there's been a lot of attention to forced labour in the UK in recent years, and I'm wondering whether you think Brexit will make any difference, and if so, in which direction, since you voted for that?
I have to say I'm very happy that we've actually been able to identify a lot of that forced labor in the UK, right? And that came about. It was not just about our team, but it was about a bunch of people working together to work out ways to see it, right? And we've been doing a lot of training of law enforcement. We do a lot of work not at the global level, but at the local level. And so in some ways, are we even seeing all we should be seeing? It's like when we discovered there was a lot of slavery in car washes in the UK. And then we developed an app that you could use to look, you could look at a car wash from across the street and put in the information, and it would tell you what the probability was that there were slaves in that car wash, which is now spread out over the population, and now it's beginning to work out. So all that's good, right? What's going to happen with Brexit? I don't know, is the short answer, because so many parts of it are still up in the air. There's a chance, I can see it going both ways. There's a chance that the number of workers who are not English-British will decline. We already see that. Workers from Latvia, from Poland, from Portugal are not coming. They're like, we don't know if we're going to have any kind of, why would I keep coming back to pick your cauliflowers when you're just going to treat me like dirt? And so they're not coming. They can't find English people to pick those fruit. They're still trying to find other people to do it. So if they're using local people, it might reduce the number who are caught up in slavery, right? But we actually know that the largest proportion of the people who are in slavery in the UK are in fact UK citizens. They're not the majority, but the largest subunit of the people caught up in slavery are UK citizens. So it may just, as Brexit kills the economy, and the whole thing is spiraling down the toilet, that's a tricky economic term, but as the whole thing is spiraling down, then there would be more poor, desperate British people who would then be able to take advantage of it. That's the bad news scenario. The good news scenario is every year, every month, pretty much, law enforcement know more about slavery, more people know how to help people out of slavery, and so forth. The response, the national response has been amazing, both across faith groups and universities. Universities are declaring themselves to be slave-free universities, which means not that they might never be a slave, but the idea that they're going to look at their food supplies, their investments, and say, we want to make sure that everyone at our university would recognize a person who is in slavery if they saw it. And we're going to try to make sure it's not in our supply chain. So my university is a slave-free university. And Nottingham City, but not the only city, other cities in Britain, have declared themselves to be slave-free cities. And they're doing the same thing. They're training everyone to look for it, and looking at all of their investments, all of their procurement to take any risk of slavery out of their economy. It's a beginning. It's a beginning. Where are we going with the insanity of this shooting yourself in the foot and in the head idea of Brexit? I don't, it's anybody's guess. We were talking about it earlier. Happily, you were able to laugh about it as an outsider, as someone who's living in the belly of the beast. I have to laugh like this. I hope that non-answer was long enough. Any other questions? Yes? Yes?
So in one of the pictures, it was like a fish market where like the child slaves were like frying the fish. So like my question is like if countries have knowledge of this like activity, of these activities going on, like why do they still trade and purchase from these markets that are using like child labor or forced labor?
Yeah, this is slavery. Now that wasn't a market. Okay, that wasn't a public space at all. That was inside that UNESCO World Heritage Site where nobody is supposed to be, and there's no legal reason for anybody to be there. That was just a big factory for drying fish. Those fish are then offloaded into fish processing stations. They go back on the boats, they go up to the coast, they go into, and they're loaded in with other fish that have been caught and processed legally, and then they're turned into cat food, they're turned into fish meal, they're turned into all this other stuff. They also grow shrimp and prawns in those camps. They dig out this, and those go also up to the frozen ones, so that when you get shrimp from frozen shrimp at the groceries, that's coming from there. So some of the shrimp you're getting, that's why nobody can see it, right? Because it's blending in with the other. But it's also, as I said before, it's because the government of Bangladesh doesn't want to do anything to hurt that sale, because it's an enormous money export for them. It's huge. It's hundreds of billions of dollars they get from that seafood that they process out. And but at least now we can tell them where it is. We can tell them if they won't send in the police yet, but we keep saying, how long are you going to do this? And we can also say to the big companies that are buying their shrimp and their fish, do you really want to have this, or do you want to get it from somewhere else? And so slowly this will evolve, we hope. You have to take a long view, right? You have to take a long view. None of these great human rights victories in human history happened with a rock concert, right? You have to say, concerts are great, let's have a lot of them, but this is going to take 20 years, this is going to take 30 years. Yes? Yes?
I mean, considering that that slavery, of course, signified strong trauma for the How do we ensure with the different research and methodology and everything that we protect also the physical and mental stability of the victims, and like during the process, I mean, you mentioned with the thing that you wanted to do
With their brains.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
how do we?
They're not going to let me cut their brains out. They've already said I don't know why. No, that's an absolutely proper, correct question. That's a good question. How do we make sure that we don't do the wrong thing with people who are already vulnerable and sensitive and hurt? Right? Well, the way that we do that is that we provided, I have to use the word carefully, we didn't sponsor, we provided the kind of launching pad for something called the Survivors Alliance. So there's a global organization of survivors of slavery. It's an organization just for survivors. You can't be in the organization unless you're a person who has survived slavery. They provide training, they provide job help, they provide a whole lot of things. And one of the things that they provide is advice from survivors of slavery on how to work with survivors of slavery. So because we actually helped found this group, and several of the people who are the leaders of this group actually are part of the Rights Lab, they're on the staff of the Rights Lab, we got the first training right, about if you're going to work with survivors of slavery, here's what you've got to do, and here's what you've got to do. But if you want to look online, Survivor Alliance, you will see things there that tell you this is how you do it without making it worse. Because I have to say, in my time with well-meaning people, I've seen people who didn't mean to hurt people who were survivors of slavery really hurt people who survived, especially in trying to get them to tell their sad story over and over, to relive the pain and suffering over and over. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't need to do that. And of course, only the ones who absolutely wanted to have their brain scanned could have their brain scanned. But we had several who said, yeah, I'd love to know, right? I'd love to know. Okay, is this the last one?
Yes,
Did you say?
we have a few others, so
Okay,
if they
good.
want to ask
Okay.
questions, I would leave, after them.
I really enjoyed the psychological part of your presentation. So I wanted to ask, but there are so many movies about concerning slavery, sexual exploitation, etc. So is this, according to you, good, or it is bad for the social acceptance of the slavery? Also because it is normalizing this aspect. Because when I go to the cinema and I see movies about that, then I go back home, but I don't think about the slavery people that are suffering.
Yeah.
I just think that it was a good movie.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if everyone could hear you, but she's asking about, we have all these films in the cinema about slavery and trafficking, like Taken, right?
Yeah.
Taken is a classic one, right? And is this good or bad? And you actually identified the little bit of goodness and also the badness, right? So it's good that it raises awareness. It's bad that it raises awareness in a way which disempowers people who are in slavery, takes away their personalities, turns them into helpless victims, right? You notice I never use the word slavery victim. I say the word slavery survivor. Because people who have been in slavery are just like you and me. Sometimes they had jobs, sometimes they had lives, they had families. They just ended up in slavery, and now they're out of slavery, right? It's like if you went to jail for a week, you wouldn't spend your life saying, I'm a convict. No, you'd just stop talking about it, probably. You'd say, no, I'm what I am. Now, it is true that the film Taken, if we could just, what is powerful about the film Taken is that it shows us how we could bring slavery to an end very quickly. All we have to do is to make sure that every single person in slavery has as their father, a rogue CIA agent with access to millions of dollars and all the weaponry in the world and no moral choice, right? Now, if we could provide that to every person in slavery, they'll be in slavery. But of course, that's a fantasy, right? It's like the worst kind of fantasy, because not only is there this pathetic victim girl, but the hero turns out to be this guy who like kills like 73 people just to, you know, it's like not the way you really want to do it.
So that's good. Forgive me, but then this takes me back to probably a final question, so sorry if I ask it. But then again, the question might be, is there any little thing that each one of us can do to help, you know, eliminate slavery?
Sure. Yeah, there are plenty of, actually there are lots of things you can do to eliminate slavery. You just did one of them, which was you learned something, right? Once you learn, you know, once you got something in your head, you can't get rid of it. So, sorry, I put a germ in your mind, so I hope it's a viral germ, and it becomes a viral idea. But the other thing is that there are actually very good groups who are doing real things. In Italy, there are really good groups who work with people who are survivors of slavery in Italy. There are groups that you can work with that are helping people out of slavery. I personally support a very small group, but every year they liberate 2 or 3 villages in hereditary slavery in northern India at very low cost. And they do it well because they've been doing it for 20 years. And they know, and there are still hundreds of villages to go, but I support that. This one's called Voices for Freedom, for example. But it could be, there are plenty of good ones, right? There are plenty of good ones. And you might just want to look around. There are some people who work on supply chains who worry about their clothes and worry about those sort of things. There are groups that do that. And there are groups that work with people locally, and there are people who work overseas, and there are people who worry about conflict, and there are people who worry, there are religious groups who work on this and so forth. So, yeah, you can go. You can find them if you look. And you can talk to other people and say, who's a good one? Yeah, now it's possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this very good presentation. Allow me to conclude this lecture by Professor Kevin Bales, thanking first of all President Pavoncello for having been with us today, thanking as well Professor Federico Argentieri, who is the director of the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs, together with Professor Michael Dreesen, the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Affairs, because these are the 2 actually bodies of our university that sponsor this talk. And thank you very much. This is also streamed online to Professor